Let me take this opportunity to introduce our chief guest, Dr. Rajesh Tandon. He is a PhD from Case Western Reserve University, USA, and an electronics engineer from IIT Kanpur with a graduation in management from IIM Calcutta. Dr. Tandon is an internationally acclaimed leader and practitioner of participatory research and development. He started his professional career in the development sector as an active intervener in the processes of social change in rural areas of India. He founded the Society of Participatory Research in Asia, PRIA. Dr. Tandon was appointed member of the subject expert group on curricular reforms and educational institution social responsibility under Unnat Bharat Abhiyan. Dr. Tandon also served as a chairperson of the Global Alliance on Community Engaged Research Network. In order to bridge the divide between the world of practice and the world of research, Dr. Tandon has undertaken a number of initiatives to promote engagement of institutions of higher education with civil society and local communities to foster knowledge generation and mutual learning. Dr. Tandon has authored more than 100 articles, books, several books including Civil Society and Governance, Reviving Democracy, Voluntary Action, Civil Society and the State, and so on. He has advocated for a self-reliant, autonomous, and competent voluntary sector in India and abroad. For his distinguished work on gender issues, the Government of India honored Dr. Tandon with the prestigious award in social justice in 2007. And in 2016, he received Nehru Literacy Award by Indian Adult Education Association. Sir, we welcome you again to the inaugural session of second doctoral colloquium. Now, may I request Dr. Tandon to enlighten us on the interaction between theories of management and development.
Namaskar. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am indeed honored to be invited on the occasion of Dr. Kurian's centenary celebrations at IRMA. I was hoping to be able to be with you for a couple of days physically, and I do promise to make it up next time, hopefully before the year is out. When Professor Biswas phoned me a couple of months ago and we started talking, I began to make some notes about why and how my journey, starting with, as you heard, engineering and management, interacted with the field of development in India, and what lessons I have learned from that, which I would like to share with you this morning. I'm going to use a slide show just to make sure that you all can hear me and see this, but the purpose is not to make you read a PowerPoint. The purpose is to help you understand. Let me ask you if you can see this. Can you see this, please?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I began to look at my own journey after my conversation with Professor Biswas and later with Professor Hippu about how did my movement from engineering to management education and then to rural development. So my early journey, 1972 to 79, I'm calling a little early journey. You heard I did my electronics engineering from IIT Kanpur, went to MBA, IIM Calcutta. And this was the time when we had some of the best professors in organizational behavior. Professor Nitish Dey was the director of the institute, Professor Gaurango Chattopadhyay, Professor Dharni Sinha, Professor Bhupen Srivastava. We had a galaxy of academics, and I was getting interested in organizational behavior despite my electronics engineering background. And while I was there, Professor Dey suggested that given my interest in teaching and research, I might consider getting appointed, and I applied and got a job. This was my first job. In those days, I think we were called associates or something, not lecturer, but it was basically entry level. In the month of January that year, Dr. Kamala Chaudhary visited IIM Calcutta campus. And Dr. Chaudhary at that time was the Ford Foundation advisor on management education. And she said, well, you want to teach and do research, you might as well do a PhD, wise advice. And she said, what is your interest? And she put me in contact with several schools, Carnegie Mellon, etc. But I went to the Department of Organizational Behavior at School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. Those were the days of emergency. And I wanted to return to do field work in India because my interest was to come and work in India. And so my doctoral field work was anchored in National Labour Institute, Delhi. National Labour Institute was just set up, and Professor Nitish Dey had joined as the first director. And when I wanted to come back to India to do field work, he said, come over here. And rural labor camps were being organized by National Labour Institute. And this was the fag end of emergency, late 1976, early 1977. Through a coincidence, by meeting by Dr. Mohan Sinha Mehta, Bhai Sahab, at National Labour Institute, I went to southern Rajasthan in the district of Udaipur through Seva Mandir to do my field work. And after that, I joined, finished my PhD in 1978 and came to Public Enterprise Center, which was set up at that time to support public enterprises in hinterland development or rural development. And it was at this period that I began to consider, in consultation with my colleagues and friends, founding of PRIA, and PRIA began to get started in 1981-82. Now, this journey tells you a little bit about what professional education I had and what I began to do. So in the initial interventions, 1980 to 86 period, I was involved through Seva Mandir, even before PRIA was set up, in training in participatory methodology. Rural women's literacy programs were being conducted by Seva Mandir and many other agencies. And in conduct of those programs, there was no methodology of how women learn. It was basically a teaching program as opposed to a learning program. And I did some work with them. You may remember that the first national program on adult education, called National Adult Education Program, was also started in 78, 79. And when training of functionaries was being designed, late Sri Anil Bodia got hold of me and said, you design these training modules because you are talking about participatory training. Later in the early 80s, the first national program for women in rural areas, Dwakra, under the IRDP, I began to do some training of Dwakra functionaries with support from UNICEF and Ministry of Rural Development. And because National Institute for Public Cooperation and Child Development, NIPSED, was anchoring the Dwakra program, there was no Ministry of Women or Child Development at that time. I did some training on participatory training methodology for NIPSED faculty in Delhi and in eastern and southern zones. And in 1984, based on some of this experience, PRIA's own program on training of trainers for those working in voluntary development organizations was mounted. And it began to be known as a signal program because a lot of students from IRMA and a lot of practitioners in voluntary agencies went through this program. The program focused on participatory learning. And when did I pick this up? When I was at Case Western, Professor David Cole, the author of Experiential Learning, was our faculty. And we had learned both the theory and practice of experiential learning. And I adapted that model in designing these number of training programs I mentioned to you earlier. Participatory learning was introduced, and through this, structured learning exercises during the training itself. So it's only after 1982, 83, 84 that you will find references to role plays, simulations, self-reflections, and understanding. Using your own experience, both past experience and experience during the training program as the source of learning. Because by this time, my belief was that any kind of personal or social change requires unlearning, relearning, and learning is actually foundational. And if we support learning, we are actually contributing to change. Because of my own training at Case Western and IIM Calcutta, I looked at the possibility, therefore, of training facilitators who could facilitate learning of others, particularly learning of rural, underprivileged and excluded communities, rural women, rural marginal farmers, rural labor. And I believe that it is possible to develop competencies, and that is what Training of Trainers program was all about in the 1980s. But this model of experiential learning was actually later on. I'm delighted to hear Professor Hippu say that there was a simulation carried out last 3 days. That's an example of using experience inside a training program to reflect on. And experiential learning is foundational, in my view, to social and personal change. The second dimension, which I introduced based on my own professional training in IIM and at Case Western, was understanding small group process. When I came in at Seva Mandir and in many development organizations, I heard people talk about, we are building farmers groups, we are building sanghas, we are building community associations, we are building community-based organizations. But what does a strong group look like? Both theoretical and practical understanding of that was inadequate. So what is a small group process? What is communication, participation, conflict resolution, leadership, etc.? And how do you gain collective strength through effectively functioning community teams? Just bringing 10 people or 15 people in a place does not make them effective functioning groups. And therefore, the training methodology that I introduced brought this theoretical understanding as well as its practical manifestations based on the work I had done myself. I introduced the concept of intergroup relations to negotiate with the delivery system. Marginal farmers, women, rural women, when they get organized, they can then deal with the frontline delivery program of the government, rural development functionaries at the block and village level through a process of negotiation, through a process of mutual engagement. And I used to train these groups myself so that they learn how to engage with BDO, how to engage with village level worker, with the literacy project officer. And therefore, the understanding and using the concept of power to influence others, the power within and the hidden power and power to transform. Because changing relations of power is fundamental to any development process. We cannot bring about sustainable development, sustainable improvement in the lives of the excluded and the marginalized without changing relations of power. And therefore, understanding power, understanding how it functions and how it can be leveraged through a collective voice of the poor was one of the theoretical perspectives that I was introducing in building community-based organizations in this period of 1983-93. The third and the last point I want to make about what I brought to this field from my expertise of professional education and management. When I walked in and started looking at organizations in voluntary sector like Seva Mandir and many others, I began to see that these were organizations designed to do something good in the society, but they were paying very little attention to themselves as organizations. And much of my training in organizational development or organizational theory was based on, and I hope that has changed now. In the early days of IIM, Calcutta, and Case Western Reserve, most of these theories and writings were based on corporate enterprises and occasionally based on public sector undertakings, but large organizations, which the theory of OD used to say that because they are over organized, you loosen them a bit, you make the place a bit more enjoyable, more participatory, etc. And to my interesting intellectual curiosity, my interaction with community-based organizations and local voluntary agencies in India in the early years suggested that actually they are quite the opposite. They are under-organized. Even founders did not know that there are some regulatory requirements or did not care. And so when 1984, I introduced a course on financial management of voluntary agencies, they thought I was spoiling the enthusiasm and creativity and spontaneity of the voluntary sector. And a lot of accusation came my way saying, oh, this American research and management expert is trying to now spoil the development organization, their spirit of spontaneity and commitment. And my argument was that along with commitment, you also need individual and organizational competence. So developing a theory of under-organized social systems. And from that, understanding a framework of organizations and interrelated subsystems. When Priya convened a first workshop on management of voluntary organizations, people said, what is management got to do with voluntary organizations? That was 1985. We went on later in late 80s, early 90s to conduct strategic planning for social change organizations, renewing organizational vision, mission, and strategy, and beginning to understand that the work we are doing is not a short-term project to be abandoned, but build organizations and institutions within the civic space, within civil society. And this understanding was not there even in funders. And they used to pretend that you are doing this project for a few years, and then there is no need to worry about the sustainability of the organization or even designing organizations appropriate to the task. Because as many organizations have since discovered, if you start getting fully funded by Government of India or state government, then you also begin to organize yourself as a government department and agency. And then your character becomes like a government agency and not as a spontaneous, flexible, resilient, adaptive civil society organization. So paying attention to the organization that is not just a temporary event or activity, but a mechanism for doing the public good that different organizations have tried to do. So we did a number of training programs on organizational vision, mission, and strategy with foundation teams, with core leadership of the organization, with the chairperson or the other members of the board. And to our great surprise, in those days, nobody had even thought about it. So in the process, Priya developed tools for organizational development and renewal. The concept of organization, subsystems, and framework are not necessarily different, but their manifestation, their adaptation in the context of civil society, which are social purpose organizations, designed to bring about change in society, therefore must also look at change within. Because if they are successful, society has changed and they should change themselves. And if they are unsuccessful in their interventions and society has not changed, even then they must change themselves all the more. So organizational renewal, organizational development for civil society required a different way of conceptualizing organizations and their contribution in the social and economic context in which they operate. And in the mid to late 90s, Priya did a number of training programs for facilitators of OD for social change organizations. And these programs became very popular. We used to get nominations from Africa and Central Europe and Southeast Asia as well. So in sum, if you look at what I brought to this field of development, largely by trial and error, not by any long-term plan, was first, learning is foundational for personal and social change. And therefore, experiential learning methods, theories, and principles for adults, adolescents, and seniors, not Piaget's child teaching theory, which was being practiced in training programs and training institutes. So participatory learning and training methodology based on the foundational perspectives of experiential learning, number one. Number two, making groups strong, effective, functional teams. And this was particularly relevant because in the early 80s, there was a post-Janta government experiment, there was a mushrooming of new generation of development organizations, and they were all committed to Freudian perspective and popular education perspective of creating local collectives. Local collective. This is pre-self-help group movement. This is pre-savings credit. In Andhra and Tamil Nadu, they used to call them social action groups. They used to call them Sangha. In Rajasthan and UP, they used to call them Sangathan. You know, different phrases were used. But the idea was collective strength. And even the work that I did at that time with trade unions working in informal sector like agriculture labor or forest workers, they themselves needed an understanding, because organizing in a formal workplace like a factory or a mine is very different from organizing in a agriculture labor or forest labor or community setting. And therefore, how do you understand and facilitate effective, transparent, accountable group functioning, team functioning of sanghas and sangatans? And it is the same model which later on was used in building cooperatives. It's a principle of cooperation, and nowadays is being used in farmer producer organizations. Wherever we need collectives, we must understand how small groups function and how we can facilitate effective, strong functioning of small groups. And so team building is not just for the staff of NGOs or development organizations. Team building, effective group building is also for community-based organizations. And the third point that I mentioned, which I brought, was an organizational view to civil society, voluntary organizations. And therefore, understanding how your organization needs periodic renewal and how you can take tools and methods of organizational development to enable that to happen. And the context in which you operate continuously changes, political, economic, social, and therefore you need to renew yourself from time to time to remain effective and remain relevant. So I must say that thank you very much for making me think about this journey, because I had never put these thoughts together in this way. And being a practitioner, I used to try out things, but not necessarily conceptualize them as I have been able to do because of your invitation. Thank you very much. And I hope the next generation of doctoral students sitting there, you all will try to learn from both the world of practice and the world of academia in a way that new theories, new formulations, and new methodologies can be evolved. I remember that when Kamlaji, I met Kamla Chaudhary ji again in 1981-82, and she said, "What are you doing now?" Well, so I said, this is what I'm doing. She said, oh, I didn't think that you would go to do PhD in management and then I come back and do this kind of work. But it has been gratifying, that is very satisfying to me, and I professionally feel more enriched. And I hope all of you who are undertaking this perspective of integrating development theories with management knowledge and profession is very important, because only then we can be called professionals in development management, and a field which is underdeveloped in India today. And I hope IRMA's DocMag programs can promote that. So thank you very much. Thank you.